All right, everyone, let's get things started. So I'd like to start by saying thank you, everyone, for joining. My name is Cody Armstrong, and today we're going to be doing a year in review, looking back 1 year and trying to point out some of the top improvements for 2020. Now, we often get asked the question, and this is kind of the premise of this webinar is, I find it difficult to maybe keep up with the 3-week improvement cycle that Onshape is constantly releasing. Is there a way that you could create an hour-long presentation that highlights some of the biggest improvements in the year? And that's kind of the premise of this webinar. So this is meant for those that don't necessarily have the time to dive into each of the 3-week improvements, but want just at a high level a year of the improvements and some of the bigger improvements. So that's kind of the premise of the webinar. It's an Onshape year in review. We're going to do 2 of these webinars. So this one's going to focus on sketches, parts, assemblies, and drawings. We'll also have another one later on this month that focuses on more advanced topics, configuration, sheet metal, etc. So Onshape year in review. Let's dive right into it. Now, as I always say with the webinars, we really encourage you to ask any questions that you'd like. There's a questions section in the GoToWebinar control panel. Feel free to ask any questions that you'd like, and I'll do my best to answer any questions as they come up. So, a few fun facts. I'm just going to jump through these. In 2020, we had 17 updates. Just over 400 improvements, dozens of performance-related improvements, none of which we'll be talking about here today, but just to show kind of what goes on behind the scenes, and nearly 80 drawing improvements. So I'm going to go over, what I think are just a handful of the top improvements in 2020. And it's important to stress, if you're looking for something in particular, I'd recommend doing a search or something like that, because we had a lot of improvements that went into Onshape in 2020. And so I'm going to have an opportunity to only just barely touch the surface of what was released in 2020. And again, I'm just pulling from things that I think will be most popular. Now, there are a few references that I'd recommend if you're looking for more information. As I mentioned before, this could be very much kind of the tip, so to speak, of the iceberg in terms of all the things that we released in 2020. But if you want to dive into more, I'd recommend checking out our changelog and our What's New blog posts. These are both good links to bookmark. Again, the changelog and the What's New blog post series. We have it's posted every 3 weeks in our blog post. These are the materials that I recommend, the references that I'd recommend if you want to stay up to date with that 3-week cadence of our updates. But those are just a few fun facts about our update. For those not familiar, we update every 3 weeks. So we had 17 in 2020, and it means a lot of improvements. What we're going to focus on are just some of the biggest in 2020. So the agenda today is pretty straightforward. We're going to take a look back at 2020 and pick out a few of the key improvements in certain areas, right? So sketches, parts, assemblies, and drawings. Just cherry pick a few what I think will be very popular improvements to highlight. But again, just going back to that number, nearly 400 improvements, there's a lot that we're not going to have an opportunity to cover in this short period. And of course, as I mentioned before, please feel free to ask any questions that you'd like, and I'll do my best to answer them. One question I see come up: can you distribute the links via email afterwards? The link to the webinar will be emailed to you afterwards. Not necessarily all the models I use, of course, but the link to this webinar will be emailed to everyone who signed up. So let's dive into it. All right, so as I mentioned before, we've broken this up into a handful of categories: sketches, parts, assemblies, and drawings. And what we have time for really is, what I've done is pick three improvements from each category that I think represent the top 3. That's highly subjective, admittedly, but I've done my best to try and pick things that I think, appeal to a broad audience, right? So let's dive into it. I'm going to start with sketches. So there are 3 big improvements that I want to mention with regards to sketches in 2020. First, create variables on the fly, quote unquote, on the fly. And that's just a phrase we refer to it internally as. But variable improvements were a big thing in 2020 because we got a lot of feedback from users. They like variable functionality, but creating them and managing them was tedious, right? And so what we wanted to do is make the process simpler for creation of variables. And so now, as of this update a few months ago, I believe, you can create variables, quote unquote, on the fly. And that just means create variables as you're adding dimensions. And I'll show you an example of that in just a second. But a very big one because it means you don't have to think ahead. You don't have to create the variable beforehand, drag it to where it needs to be in the feature list, and then create that feature that's tied to it. So a little bit easier user interface for creating variables, and it just simplifies the process a great deal. The other one is constraining spline handles. This is something that a lot of users requested. If you do any kind of surface modeling, any kind of work with splines, really, one of the more common questions we got is, how do I manipulate the spline handles? I know I can grab and drag, but how do I constrain them, right? Or how do I dimension them? And so there were workarounds in the past where you could sketch lines between the points and use that. But now the spline handles are entities that you can select, that you can constrain, that you can dimension, right? And so an important improvement for those working a lot with splines, the ability to constrain and dimension spline handles. So the final sketch improvement that I want to mention is inferencing improvements. This is a subtle one, and many of these, frankly, are subtle ones. But if you've ever done these things, or you do these things on a regular basis in Onshape, you'll know that we've made some serious improvements in how it behaves. So while they may seem subtle and small, they can be very big in terms of day-to-day use, especially with sketching, because sketching is stuff we do all day, every day. All right, so let's jump into a few examples of this. I want to dive into a very simple example of variables, and I want to go through the workflow that we've done in the past and how we've improved it, right? So it's very simple. If you've ever worked with variables prior to this update, what you had to do was click variable, give your variable a name. Let's call this OD1 and give it a value. Right, and there's other things you could do. You could define different types of variables and so on. But at the basic level, creating a variable, just give it a name and a value. You'd hit OK, and you'd see this variable in your feature list. Now, if you wanted to use this in a sketch or a feature above the variable, you'd have to drag it above, right, or roll up first. But it needs to be in the right position. So you kind of have to think about, where's the variable going? Where am I going to use it, and so on. So now I have the variable here, it's in my feature list. I can now actually use it, right? So there's the step of creating the variable. Then there's the step of actually going into the sketch and, changing something, right? So if I go in here, I can use hash symbol OD1, right? And it allows me to grab that variable. So that's been the usual workflow, right? To date, before this improvement, you would create the variable, then you would go into the feature or sketch that you want to use that variable, type hash symbol, and you would find your variable name there. But the feedback that we got is we'd like to be able to create variables on the fly as we're sketching and not have to think ahead and create the variable as a feature and and drag it to where it needs to be in the feature list. We want it to be a bit more intuitive. And so the thought was we allow the user to create variables as they're adding dimensions, right? And so it's a very subtle thing, but if you do a lot with variables, it's a big improvement. So instead of creating a feature first, I just go straight into my sketch as if I were sketching, right? I find the thing that I want to link to a variable, in this case, this OD dimension. I double click as if I were changing a dimension, right? I use the same hash symbol, and you'll see there's this option that pops up as soon as you hit the hash symbol key that says new variable. And so essentially, this just launches the variable dialog within the sketch. What I really like about this, though, is it automatically chooses the correct combination of things, right? So you can have different variable types. But if you select a dimension, you're saying, I want a variable tied to a length, right? Because naturally, that's the dimension. So it will select the appropriate type of variable type without having to do anything special, right? Now it's pretty straightforward. You just type a name, let's say OD1. It grabs the value that's there by default, another cool aspect of doing it this way. And then you could just hit the green check, OK. Notice what happens is it adds the variable above the feature where you want to use it. So you don't have to think about where am I going to use it, make sure it's higher than that in the feature list. It knows all that, right? So it just puts that in the necessary place. So that's really all it takes. If you want to create variables, type the hash symbol into the dimension dialog, the little window, and you'll see this new option for new variable, right? You create the variable on the fly, and now you have variables in your feature list without having to go through the effort of clicking variable, defining it beforehand, dragging it up into its correct place in the feature list. It's much, much easier, right? So that's what we refer to as creating variables, quote unquote, on the fly. And it just means that you don't have to go through the headache of defining the feature first. All right, so the next one that I have is constraining spline handles. So this is another one, again, that's subtle, right? It's not a big change, but if you do a lot with splines, and we know there are a lot of people out there that do, this is a big quality of life improvement. That's the best way to describe it. Because again, you would have to go through several additional clicks to do something like this previously. So let's go to an example. Bear with me for a moment here. Let's say that I'm designing a spray nozzle, right? And I'm, have this spline. Let's find the edge here. Let's say that I have this sketch that's, composed of a spline. And of course, any spline has the handles, right? Now we've had spline handles, of course, for, since we added splines. It's not a new feature. What is new is the spline handle itself is a selectable line, so to speak, right? So this is a selectable thing, and that wasn't always the case. You could select the endpoints of the spline handle, but the line itself wasn't always a selectable object. And so what a lot of people had to do was create a construction line and then sketch a line between the 2 points and then constrain that. Right? So there were ways to accomplish this before, but if you have 2 spline handles on every spline and you work with dozens of splines, manually adding lines is a tedious task, right? And so in short, now when you go to dimension or constrain, you can select this spline handle as a selectable piece of geometry and define it, right? Define the length of the spline handle, its constraints with surrounding geometry. All of that is much easier to do now as of this update last year, right? So that is improvements to spline handles, splines in general, and the ability to select a spline handle as a selectable object, right? Question, will there be a place for a reminder of what type to create the variable? What type to create the place reminder? I'm not sure I follow. Of what to type to create the variable. Oh, I think you would have to go into, there are different variable types, and I believe the help will define what is acceptable in terms of values for the different types of variables. Forgive me if I'm misunderstanding. But the hash symbol is across all variables, doesn't matter what type. You have to use the hash symbol anytime you want to access a variable, regardless of the variable type. All right, so let's move on to the next one on my list. So this is inferencing improvements. This is another one that sounds very small, right? At a glance, it's like it doesn't sound huge, but this is one of the probably the single biggest sketch improvements that we've made, in many years now. That is a productivity improvement, right? And I'm going to jump into an example. Bear with me for a second here. Let's go into the seal retainer. And so essentially, the way this improvement works, the improvement here is that you can reference edges, midpoints, arcs of anything that's coplanar to your sketch plane, right? Now, this was a limitation in the past, especially if you had planes that happen to be coplanar with a face. What would happen is you would not be able to constrain relative to pieces of the surrounding geometry, right? Again, this sounds really subtle and simple, but if I were to take you back, a year, and you were to try and sketch a line, for instance, that's attached to this edge, you would find that you have to sketch the line and then manually attach it afterwards, right? Because there was no way to inference things that were coplanar to the thing that you were sketching on. And in this case, this face is coplanar to the plane that I'm on, right? And in this case, so if I wanted to grab the arc, the center point of the arc, any kind of reference off of these, surrounding faces, I would have to sketch the geometry and then manually constrain. But now, because we've brought those inferences through, anything that's coplanar, you will automatically get the midpoints, the endpoints, the arcs and edges themselves. And so I can grab the midpoint of this arc, snap a line to the center, and not have to manually constrain anything, right? And so there's a lot of use cases for this. This is essentially useful in nearly any sketch environment, right? Especially if sketches on top of sketches or sketches that are on planes that are coplanar. Any of those kinds of scenarios is going to be tremendously useful because it just saves that effort of sketch, hold control or, do whatever combination you want for keyboard shortcuts and then select the constraint afterwards as a manual step. You're just automatically constraining. Now, this did work in the past if everything was in a single sketch, right? It was all in one environment. The improvement here is the ability to grab anything that happens to be coplanar and use that as a reference without manually doing it, right? Without manually constraining. So very simple improvement, but I think a huge quality of life improvement that nearly everyone will agree is a big deal because it just means a lot less manual constraints. All right, so let's move on. The next category in our list is parts. So there are a few highlights that I want to point out in the Part Studio environment in 2020. Now, as I mentioned before, there were a lot of improvements in 2020, so it's difficult to pick your top three. And as I mentioned before, highly subjective, but I'm doing my best to pick those that I think people will like. The first is isolate. This is something that was highly requested. We had the ability to isolate at the assembly level, and it was very much a liked feature, but we didn't have the ability to do this in the Part Studio. And so if you have a multi-part Part Studio, which is a very common thing in Onshape, you didn't have the ability to quickly isolate things. And there are a few really neat use cases for where you might isolate a Part Studio that are actually unique to Part Studios, that are a bit different than Assemblies. But in general, isolate is something we brought to the Part Studio that was highly requested and, again, was in the past limited to Assemblies. The next one is hole tables. This is something we did in a very unique, very Onshape way. We have our own built-in hole table functionality. Anytime you use hole feature, a hole table is automatically created. And I think this is useful in a number of different ways. But the biggest thing I would point out about this is you can look at all the hole information in the 3D model without ever creating a drawing, inserting views, inserting hole tables, and making a formal drawing of it. If you just want to know what are all the holes in this part, open up the hole table in the Part Studio, and you'll have all the details there, right? We found a lot of users, if they just want to know what size hole is this and how many of them are there, they would have to create a drawing, insert tables, things like that, or know how to navigate the feature list. But now, I could send this model to someone and just say, click the hole table, and you have all the details for the holes that you need, right, without having to create a drawing. Now, of course, you still can create drawings, and we have hole table functionality at the drawing level as well. But the neat thing this does is it brings it into that 3D environment. It allows you to cross-select and do all kinds of cool stuff. All right, so that is hole tables. The last one is face colors. And this is another one that sounds very simple, very subtle, but is probably one of the most requested features that we've had in a number of years. This is highly, highly requested. And although, it is simple, it is something that nearly everyone wanted. It was something that we heard a lot. So let's dive into each of these. So there are a few examples that I want to show, but let's start with the hydraulic seal retainer and isolate. So I mentioned before the ability to isolate in the past was limited to the assembly. And, you know, the ability to do it at the assembly level was, very well liked. The ability to isolate, it was a very popular feature. But one common criticism was, well, I want to be able to do the same thing at the part studio. And we didn't have that functionality until this most recent update, or the recent update in 2020. So it's very simple. You find the thing you want to isolate, in this case, center housing, let's say, and you right click and isolate, right? So it works exactly the same way as it does at the assembly level, right? Right click the thing you want to isolate, select isolate. You can select multiple parts if you'd like, right, and isolate them. So you have the same kind of flexibility that you'd had at the assembly level. You can also choose to expand based on connectivity and distance and bring in additional parts, right, into the isolate, just with that grab and slide functionality. Same thing as at the assembly level. But the most important thing, in my opinion, is this really does simplify the ability to interact with certain faces or parts that were otherwise difficult to access, right? A lot of people are aware of select other, where you can right click, select and then grab, a face or something along those lines. But this actually allows you to grab holes, faces, edges that are inside of the model very quickly, right? And it's more of a persistent state than if I were using select other. And so a lot of times we get asked the question, how would you handle, working on the part that's inside of another part? And a lot of people will hide. They will hide those outside parts, right? But then you're turning them on and off when you want to grab things from them. It becomes much more difficult when you actually need them. The neat thing about isolate is everything is still there, right? And I can bring it in or not, right, very quickly. But I can also grab the faces, the edges, all those types of things without having to do select other or any kind of other, selection sets. So that is isolate in the part studio. Of course, it's just a simple function. Select the thing you want to isolate, right click and isolate it. But the big news here is it's been brought into the Part Studio and means that it allows you to interact with the Part Studio, especially these kind of nested multi-part Part Studios. It allows you to interact with them in a more detailed way, easier way. All right, so that is isolate in the Part Studio. The next one that I have is whole tables. This is another one that I think we've done in a really unique way, and that is essentially anytime you use whole feature, our standard out of the box whole feature that you see in the Part Studio toolbar. Anytime you use whole feature to create a whole, you will automatically get this whole table flyout on the right hand side. And if you've known Onshape, you've used Onshape for other more advanced features like configurations or appearances or so on, you'll know this flyout on the right hand side has a lot of different functions. So what we've done is build this table into a interactive piece of the UI, right? So again, a lot of people will create a drawing just to get the whole table, and they'll have the references and so on. But if all you're looking for is whole information and where those holes correspond with the part, this is just as useful, and there's no need to create a drawing. And so in this case, you can see here, I've hovered over the tag A for my whole table, and you can see it says quantity 4, and it highlights the edges associated with those holes. And so it's easy for me to get that kind of cross highlight functionality that even if I didn't model this part, I can quickly find the whole information. And I think that's one of the biggest benefits of using this. Of course, it's nice if I just have a very complex part with lots of holes to be able to glance at everything quickly. But I think the real benefit of this is, I didn't model it, but I want to know what are all the holes. Maybe I need to buy taps or something like that, taps or drills or whatever it may be. I can just open up the whole table and go through all the various holes and even just mouse over them and see where they correspond with the model itself, right? So a great visual, right? It allows me to see what's on the part, see what the whole sizes are, and of course how many quantity there are. Now, as I mentioned before, this is you have the ability to do this at the drawing as well, right? So if you want your whole call in the drawing, of course that still exists, but the big benefit I think is the ability to interact with these holes without having to create a drawing and insert a table. Right? One final comment is you can copy this. There's a copy functionality here that allows you to bring this out into a different place. I'm often asked the question, what if I have, holes that I want to drop into some software and then maybe use to cut on LaserJet or something like that. And you could do that. You can, bring all of this whole information into a single sheet and use that to drive other things. So that is whole tables. Again, the big thing to stress is anytime you use the whole feature, Onshape's default whole feature, you will automatically get this flyout. And you don't have to do anything with it. It's much like the bill of materials at the assembly level. The more features you add, the more things get added to the whole table color. But you don't have to interact with it. You're not forced to, but it's just a neat way to see all of the holes in a part in a single place in the Part Studio. So that is whole tables. Let's move on to the next one. And this one is face colors. The reason I think this is so important is just the sheer number of requests that we got for this. This is a very simple feature in how you use it and how it's supposed to work. It's you apply a color to a face. The limitation in the past was you could only apply a color to a part. Part was the lowest level, so to speak. And so your entire part always had one color, right? But we often got asked, well, I want to make this color of this part this, right? And there are lots of different examples of why, but it was a limitation. In the past, you had to apply the appearance at the part level, and the entire part was the same color. So a simple thing, admittedly, but something that was really highly requested. So although it's probably one of the simpler improvements we got, it's probably one of the highest requested in terms of just sheer number of people asking for it over the last several years. So it's really simple to use. As I mentioned before, there are a few examples where you might want to use it. One example that we were often asked is, I want to be able to define machined surfaces versus painted surfaces, or machined versus cast, or I just want to be able to delineate between surfaces that are certain color and surfaces that aren't. Machined surface is probably one of the more common examples. And so the way it works is you essentially just right-click the thing that you want to change the color of, right? So I right-click a face, and I say I want to change the appearance to this face, right? And so that's the improvement. If you right-click a face in the Part Studio, very important to stress, this is done in the Part Studio. Right-click a face. In the right-click menu, you will see the option Add Appearance to Face. Fairly straightforward. It brings up the appearance dialog, right? And you can choose your appearance, right? Let's make this kind of a machined aluminum look, right? So that's as easy as it can be. Right-click the face or faces and choose Add Appearance. Now, one neat thing that you can do that not many people are aware of is you can also choose features. So if you have a feature that created a whole series of faces and you want to change the color of all those faces at once, just select the feature, right? You don't have to choose faces. You can choose features, and the features will automatically grab all the faces associated with that feature, right? So that is face colors, face appearances. And again, it's just a matter of right-clicking on the face and choosing that option to add appearance to face. Now, I will say once you have an appearance associated with the face, you right-click on it, you have this edit option, right? So it's important to keep in mind if you need to go back and change a face color, just go back to that same right-click menu, right-click the face, and you'll see instead of add, it will say edit, right? And you can go right back into that dialog. Another neat thing that we did with this same update is the appearance flyout, right? So the appearance panel on the right-hand side. This is another use of the right-hand, panel flyout, but it gives you all the appearance information in that Part Studio. So you can see that most of my appearances are applied at the part level, right? The center housing, the valve side housing, these are all part level appearances. But there is a drive side housing that is largely blue, but has one face selected that is this this color that we specified. If I double click, it will take me back into that appearance dialog, and I can change the color from here also. So just a tip, if you prefer to interact with all of your appearances in a single flyout, a lot of people will build their model and then go through this appearance flyout and make everything look realistic as kind of a last step. And this is an easy way to go through everything at once and do that. Right. So that's the appearances and face appearances and the appearance panel flyout. Right. All right, so that is face colors or face appearances. Let's move on to the next topic in the list, and that is assemblies. So there's one really big improvement that we did with assemblies in 2020 that, of course, I want to start with, and that is exploded views. For a number of years, of all the improvements that we're going to talk about today, this is the most requested. This is the most across the board, whether it's professionals or enterprise or students. Everyone wanted exploded views, and so it's a really popular, important feature of any CAD system. And in this case, we added it in 2020. Now, usual Onshape fashion, we've done a lot of unique things with exploded views, and I'll go through and highlight some of them in this webinar. But we've done a dedicated webinar on exploded views. So if you're interested in really diving into exploded views, the details of creating exploded views, I'd really recommend checking out that webinar. It's a whole hour on that topic alone, and we'll give you a lot more information than I'll be able to get to here. So that was a very big improvement. I think it was in the February update in 2020. So we added exploded views. Now we also added a number of other improvements that I think are valid. And by the way, when I say exploded views, I also include exploded view lines and the ability to insert those exploded views into drawings. All of those things kind of came in 2020. Another highly requested one, very simple but very important, mass override. So you have the ability to assign a material to your parts in Onshape, right? And that will give you a mass. But oftentimes we're asked, well, I imported this part. I know what the weight is, and I can't figure out how to get the material to match the weight. And so what you do is you just override the mass. And I'll show you an example of this in just a second. Particularly important, in my opinion, when you've imported parts or imported geometry and you need to assign the mass. You know what the weight is. You need to assign it, right? In the past, people would choose random materials that got it close, but there's never really a good way to define a mass, right? So mass override, that's a very big one for assemblies. The final one, somewhat related to mass override, is the center of mass display. This is another one that was highly requested at the assembly level, some kind of visual for the center of mass. And so we now have that. In the past, we had center of mass as units. You could see the numbers, the location for the center of mass, but there's never any visual in the assembly itself of where that center of mass was. So that's the improvement that was added in 2020. You'll actually see a little indicator at the center of mass when you're looking at mass properties. All right, so let's dive into it. I'm going to spend just a few minutes going over exploded views. I know that I'm just going to touch the surface for many people out there. But again, I'd recommend if you're interested in a deep dive in exploded views, check out the webinar we did right after we launched it. So let's start with how to start your exploded view. So here we have this worm gear assembly. And of course, the goal here is to create an exploded view. Now, a lot of the functionality I've shown you over the last 10 minutes or so has involved interacting with these flyout panels. And the exploded views is the same functionality. So on the right side, in any assembly, you will see this exploded views flyout, right? I left click that and it brings up the exploded views flyout panel where I can build my exploded view. It's fairly straightforward. You click add exploded view, right? And you'll see the toolbar disappears because you're going into an exploded view mode. And that's the way to think of this. And so if I want to go back and edit mates or actually manipulate the assembly outside of creating exploded views, I would need to click done to get back into that assembly editing mode. But in my case, I want to create an exploded view. And so I start by dragging components. You see it gives me instructions here. I'm just going to grab a series of bolts, right? And I'm going to drag them out. So we'll grab and drag. And what you'll see is as soon as I let go of the mouse, the explode step 1 appears, as well as default explode lines. Now the explode lines are on by default, and they come from the centroid of the model. But you can adjust that. If you want explode lines that come from a very specific place, you can choose a vertice, a face, an edge, right? And the explode lines will reroute, so to speak, from that reference, right? But by default, when you go to create your exploded views, you will automatically get explode lines, and those explode lines will be from the centroid of the part that's being moved. Now, the other thing I would point out is by default, you're just dragging it out at random distances, but you can type in actual values, right? So I can type in an actual offset. And as you start to get into more complex exploded views where you have many different exploded elements, you want evenly spaced exploded views, those types of things, the explode distance becomes important. In fact, I've even seen people use variables in configuration variables to control these types of things. So there's lots of really neat things that you can do with the distance itself. The last comment I would add is by default, when you go to select parts and grab and drag, it's just using the default orientation of the assembly. But you can specify a direction. And so if I need to explode along a certain direction, along a certain edge or an axis, I can click specify direction and then click on an edge or a reference, and it will explode along that direction, right? Question, is it possible to turn off explode lines? Yes. If you check the box explode lines, they will turn off. So that's really it to creating exploded views. I hit the green check. Now I have my first explode step, right? And I could go right into the next step. So I'll click the housing here, grab and drag, and now I've got a new explode line, a new explode step, right? I can hit the green check, move on, grab the next one, drag, right? And very quickly start to tear the assembly apart, right? So just keep in mind the explode steps, very easy to create, and just grab and drag until you've disassembled your assembly, right? I'm going through this quickly here, but you kind of get the idea. So now I've created this explode view, right? And what I want to do is go over a few tips that I have for you for interacting with exploded views. Just a few random tips, so bear with me for a moment here. Let me jump into my planetary gearbox. And while I'm doing that, let me answer a quick question. If the same components are then exploded orthogonally to where they are now, the lines will follow. Yes, if they're exploded in a separate step. So I showed you one explode step, but you can have multiple explode steps, and it will capture those movements with explode lines. Can you turn off individual explode? That's a good question. I don't think so. I think it's every explode line associated with the movement. Now you could just create one explode movement involving one part and then turn off that individual explode line. I'll double check this. I don't think there's a way to turn off individual explode lines if I'm generating multiple at once, like a right click hide type functionality. But I'll double check that just to make sure I'm right. All right, so let's go back to kind of the basics. And what I want to do is go over a few of the things that I think are really unique about our exploded views, and things I like to point out. The way we've created exploded views is unique in the sense that you interact with this flyout, right? You have this flyout that comes out from the right side, and each explode step is essentially very much like a feature in a feature list. It's regenerated in a specific order. And that means that you can change, explode step order by just grabbing and dragging. Let's go ahead and activate this explode. right? So you can activate individual explodes by right-clicking. You can expand them out and see individual explode steps. Edit from the right-click menu as well, right? And dive into each individual one. Now, when you do this, you'll see, let's go into another explode step here, that while I'm editing, right, let's say that I'm editing this, I can also roll back, right? I can grab this rollback bar and roll up and down in my various explode steps. So I can interact with it as if it were a series of features in a feature list, right? And so we wanted this to feel, to look like and behave like features in a feature list, where you can grab and drag and reorder, and use this rollback bar as a way of seeing all the various steps, right? And I know people who've actually jumped through each step, recorded their screen, and animated a video from it. One question I see there: can I record this to make an animated output? And the answer is not today. We don't have you can record your screen, of course, but there's no Onshape function to accomplish that. You would use generic screen recording tools, and then just go through your various explode steps. But that is an improvement that we've heard a lot from others, so it wouldn't surprise me to see it added in the future. But there's no way today to animate all these steps and save that as a animated output, an animated video. Now, another comment I would add about exploded views is you can have multiple, right? So you'll see I actually have 3 different exploded views here. There's lots of different examples. Maybe you just need different exploded views to show different steps, or whatever the use case may be. But the big thing I like to stress about this is you're not limited to a single one. You can have as many as you'd like. Another really neat thing about this is it applies across all configurations. So a single exploded view you can create one exploded view for hundreds of configurations of your assembly, right? And you don't have to recreate the exploded view for each individual configuration, right? And as I mentioned earlier, there's lots of really neat things you can do with configurations and exploded views to automate the process of building them. But definitely, if you're interested, check out the exploded views webinar that we did in the past, and I believe we've also done an advanced exploded views webinar that goes over some of those in more advanced details. Now, of course, anything you create here in the assembly level, any exploded views that you go to create here, are easily inserted into the assembly. When you go to insert them into the assembly, you'll see an option to choose exploded view. All right, so for the sake of time, I'm going to move on. But again, I highly recommend check out the webinars we've done in the past if you want a deeper dive into exploded view. All right, the next one that I have is mass override. This is one that I think is particularly important if you work a lot, like many people do, with imported geometry, right? So let's go back here to our hydraulic steering pump. This is the part studio that we were looking at just a moment ago. And in this part studio, let's actually go into a bit more realistic. Let's go into the drive shaft example. Let's say that I import these gears. Maybe this is a combination that I import from make MasterCar or someone else. And so what happens is you'll get these imported parts, and the weight of them, right? Because it's in a book, it's in a manual, you've weighed it, but the weight of the physical object that's going into your assembly. You know the weight of the thing, you bought it, and the vendor sent you a parasolid or whatever it is. And so what happens is the weight is very difficult to get right in Onshape, right? At least prior to this update. You'd have to assign a material and then look at the weight, change the material, assign the weight. It's very tedious to even get it close, and it was not perfect. So what we've done is say, well, rather than allowing the person to do some kind of custom material definition, just allow them to define the mass directly. And the way you do that is through the mass properties dialog. So when you select the part in the part studio that you want to change or override the mass of, and then you left click display mass properties, you'll see this override checkbox. right? So it's by default going to give you a value, assuming you've applied material, but you just check override and you can type in whatever value you want for that, right? This has lots of implications downstream naturally when you take a part that has, an assigned mass and you insert it into the assemblies, and it has those downstream effects. But the big thing is now you can have accurate weights, accurate center of mass, without having to manually manipulate it, right, in a very tedious way. So again, the improvement here is really just this checkbox for override. So when you select the part, click Display Mass Properties, check Override, type in the weight, and that's really all you have to do. The most common example, the reason that I think most people want this is they want the ability to import geometry from other systems that they know the weight of and just assign the weight. Right. All right, so that is mass override. And you may have caught the next improvement there. It's a subtle thing, but the next improvement I want to talk about is center of mass display. It's technically not just for the assemblies, but I think it's most relevant at the assembly level, right? And so it's real simple, right? In your assembly, let's just select our assembly here. If I go to Display Mass Properties, so I'm just selecting the assembly, clicking Display Mass Properties, you will see, right, center of mass right here, right? So that's really the improvement, is that visual indicator. We had the values in the past. So you could see X, Y, and Z values. We had that previously. So you could figure out where the center of mass was, but there's no easy way to visually see it. So what we added with this is the ability to see that little point in space with respect to your assembly or part, right? So that's the improvement around center of mass. It's just this little visual indicator as to where that place is. There are lots of designs, lots of products out there where center of mass is a really critical thing, and you may just want to constantly be able to revisit it. Good question. Would be useful to override mass at the subassembly level, multi-body level. Well, I can override mass here at the subassembly level, right? So to be clear, this is a subassembly mass, and I'm checking override, and I'm typing in an overrided mass for this subassembly. Multi-body, well, let's just try it. Forgive me, multi-part. Let's just try to be safe. Yeah, that's a limitation, right? You wouldn't assign the mass to all the parts. You would create an assembly and override the mass of the subassembly, right? But that's a good question. I showed you the example of overriding a single part, but if you want to override the whole assembly, you can do that too. Where the limitation lies is like selecting handfuls of parts, right? Or multi-part in your example. Okay, so we have a few more minutes, just 10 more minutes left, and I want to dive into the final topic of the day, and that is drawings. Now, I will say, of all the things that we talked about so far, in terms of sheer volume of improvements, drawings got the most attention. And it's, drawings is a very detailed, nuanced thing. It's something that has lots and lots of options and checks boxes and just lots of complexity because there's so many possibilities when creating a drawing. And so naturally you would expect lots of improvements to drawings, and that's what we've seen. I showed you earlier on, we had around 80 improvements just to drawings alone in 2020. So picking the three of all the categories, this is the most difficult because just there's so many. There's so many drawing improvements in 2020. But I want to start with what I think is the most popular. This is another one that's been requested for many, many years, and that is markup. The ability to mark up drawings is something that people have asked for since we've had drawings. And it's something we now have. As of 2020, you can now mark up your drawings. Now, I should stress, markup is not specific to drawings. It actually works in parts and assemblies as well. but I think many people are going to use it at the drawing level, and so I included it as a drawing improvement. But just to stress, if you ever need markups at the part or assembly level, you can do that too. Now, there are a few other improvements I'd like to mention. Smart revision tables is a big one. You're using release management. You have the revision table inserted into your drawing. You want it to behave in an intelligent way. So what we've done is build a smart revision table that allows you to set number of revisions you want to keep and automatically exclude. And it does a lot of things that would be tedious to set up and administer in many kind of traditional PDM systems. So smart revision tables, a very big one in drawings. And then finally, callout grouping. So revision tables or balloons, you can now group with dimensions and they behave in a grouped fashion. This is really important when you're tying callouts of any kind. It could be rev callouts or balloons or whatever it is to a dimension, because now they behave as one thing, right? In the past, if you wanted to relate to things, you just had to put them close to each other and hope that, no one would notice they're not linked, right? But now you can actually group these things together. All right, so we have a few minutes left. Let's dive into these last few improvements and go over where I think they're most useful. So what I'd like to do is dive into a real simple example of how to use markup, and I think how it's going to be, most popular, right? And that's because a lot of users want the ability to take a look at the drawing and say it needs to add this, you got to get rid of this, you're missing that, and they want to be able to relay that to someone else, right? That's where markup is really useful. Now, the way you access markup is via comments. So all markups are essentially just integrated into Onshape comments. They're an additional function within Onshape comments. And so the way it works is you click comments, you'll see this little button for markup at the bottom right corner of the comment dialog. And so I click markup, and what happens is it takes me into this markup mode, right? So the toolbar disappears, the drawing now appears, but I have this limited tool set, really just markup tools, right? And they're fairly straightforward. So you have arrows, lines, a pencil or a pen, you have ellipse, rectangle, and of course, text. And then you have these simple shapes that you can define with separate colors, right? And it's fairly self-explanatory. If I want to create an arrow and I set my color, so I want a red arrow, I just click the 2 and then left click drag an arrow, right? Now, you could do, of course, a number of other things. So I can have, rectangles. I can have an ellipse, right? I can have text, right? So if I want text, I can left click and drag this out and say, what radius is this, right? So I can add a text box to my drawing and to my markup. But that's really it. You have your markup tools. You have some basic, shapes that you can define. You mark up the screen, in this case, the drawing. As soon as you're done, you hit the green check. And what you'll notice happens is it takes that markup screenshot and it attaches it to a comment. And so now I can easily say, can you take a look at this, right? And I can even ping people associated with it. I can assign it as a task using, the @ functionality, but it's all built into the comments, right? So it takes that markup, it attaches it to the comment, right? And you can see that's what the user will see. So if I'm communicating with someone who's maybe doing my drafting work and I add a comment, they're going to fly out and see this screen, right? And then I left click, it brings up the markup and I can see it in full resolution, right? So that is markups. Again, a relatively simple feature, but something that many people have requested. And we still, to the point when we released this, most people were using screenshot tools. They'd grab a screenshot. They would use some other software like a markup tool, like a Snagit, for instance. And then we attach that to an email and then email it to someone, and they would mark up their screen and then send it back. And so the idea behind this is try and keep all of that communication inside of the comments, right? And by allowing you to mark up your Onshape interface and attach it to a comment, you don't have to go to external tools to accomplish that same functionality. right? And more importantly, it's all integrated. It's all fully intact in that single document. Right? You don't have to go to an email history to find why a certain decision was made. So that's comments and the ability to add markup to comments. And as I mentioned before, this is not specific to drawings, right? So if I go into the comments, I can add new comments afterwards and add markups to them, right? So I could go in and mark up, and this, in this case, the 3D model, and say, is this right? Right? Is this the right color? Hit OK, and now it's going to mark up or attach that markup to my comment, but of the 3D model. So just to stress, not specific to drawings, but I think it's going to be most common at drawings because that's where many people have requested it. So that is markup. We have just a few minutes left, so I'm going to go over these final few very quickly. Smart revision tables is a very neat aspect of Onshape because it allows you to insert a revision table, have it automatically update, and truncate in situations where you want it limited. And if you've ever set up revision tables in traditional systems, getting the revision table to behave in a way that you would expect can be challenging. So to go through this quickly, you'll see a new Insert Revision Table icon in the toolbar, right? You click, you insert, right? You can define, is it a multi-sheet or just a single sheet, right? Is it, how many visible rows do you want, right? And what order should it be in, top to bottom or the inverse? And then, of course, you can also define your fixed corner, very similar to bill of materials, right? So that's your options. You hit OK, and it inserts your revision table. What's really neat about this is if you were to release, right? Let's do that. Let's just release the drawing. Let's grab the drawing and the part. Let's release them here and say this looks good, right? And let's release it. It will automatically update, right, that instance, right? And the big thing is, especially if you get into more complex revision tables where you have dozens of revisions, and managing that revision table for a lot of companies is still a very manual process. The neat thing here is I'm defining the number of rows. It's all built into the release management tools of Onshape. So if I add 10 revisions, it will automatically start to truncate and give me kind of an intelligent revision scheme, right? Intelligent revision table, I should say. All right, final comment on drawing improvements is the callout grouping, right? The callout grouping is, balloons, any type of callout. I'll give you an example. Let's say that I add a revision callout. To add a revision callout, I just right-click the revision table. You'll see this add revision callout, and I can attach or group that callout with a dimension, right? In the past, you had to manually line these up, and there was never a good way to get the two associated with each other. But now you can group them. And so now when I left click and place this revision callout and I grab and drag, it will update, right? It will move along with it. But you want to be careful. You'll have options for top, left, right, bottom. You want to make sure you're, attaching to the right place. But that's grouping the callout with the dimension. You'll see as you drag it around, it will snap to those callout points, right? And you'll see them there as well. Callouts, balloons, revision callouts like this of any type can now be grouped. So that is the final drawing improvement that I wanted to mention. Now, I asked, as in preparation for this webinar, I asked a member of our product dev team that works on drawings to give me your list of your top 5 improvements, just to make sure that I was on the right page and that I highlighted the right things. And in usual product developer fashion, I asked for 5, and Pete, for those that know Pete Yodis, gave me 40. So this is just a sampling of some of the other improvements that came in 2020 in drawings. As I mentioned, there were a lot of improvements. This is only half of what was added in 2020 just in drawings. But this is his top 40 improvements in 2020 in no particular order, but just something. I know there's a lot of text on the screen. You won't be able to read that. If you're watching the recording, go back and pause. But a lot of improvements in drawings in 2020. So that is it. I have one final comment. If you're interested in learning more, if you're interested in self-paced training, instructor-led training, technical briefings, or getting certified in Onshape, definitely check out the Onshape Learning Center. And you can find it at learn.onshape.com. So that's it, everyone. If you have any other questions, please feel free to type them in, and I will do my best to answer them before we wrap up. But that's it. Thank you, and have a good day.